Welcome to Adventures in Sociology and Criminology. I'm your host, Danielle McCartney, and today we're going to talk about labeling theory and how labeling theory explains deviant behavior. Let's get started. Labeling theory is based in theories of the self that emphasize how we develop a self-identity and how concerns about the self can push us into deviance. Labeling theory explains how labeling someone as deviant creates a self-fulfilling prophecy because we create the conditions for that person to become deviant, even if they weren't before we started labeling them as deviant. So let's talk a little bit about developing a sense of self. Overall, labeling theory, or identity theory that it's sometimes called, argues that our behavior, how we act, is a process where we try to establish and confirm a workable self-image. Infants are not born with knowledge. Everything we think or know is acquired by associating with other people. Other people give us ideas about how to navigate the world, about what behaviors are appropriate and what behaviors are not appropriate, and about who or what we are. It's important to remember, though, that the process of learning is not a one-way street. Learning is a negotiation. Others give us information based on how they understand the world. That is, they have a particular definition of the situation, of particular acts, or of particular types of people. The definition of the situation is generally agreed upon. It's a subjective understanding of what will happen in a given situation or setting and who will play which roles in the action. The definitions of a situation get shared through interaction so that many members of a particular culture share a very similar definition of the situation. So as children, we learn about these definitions of a situation. As children, we take on the perspectives of others, the perspectives other people are teaching us, and try it out. As we are developing our sense of self, this is called role taking. We take on the roles of others and try them out. So in this process of role taking, we think through how our reactions would appear to them, and then we perform some behavior. And once that behavior is out there, others observe it, think about what our behavior means, and then respond to our behavior based on what they think it means, what they think our intentions might be, and what the significance of our intentions or behavior might be. Then we process their responses and we react to those responses. The process of processing information and the subsequent reaction creates this kind of complex pattern of interaction. These patterns of interactions we see every day. Some of those patterns of behavior become habitual or routinized so that patterns of action, interpretation, and reaction become really a hidden process. We don't recognize this pattern. Our experience just becomes true, and we rarely reflect on how the action, response, reaction starts or how it affects the way we think about ourselves. Charles Horton Cooley talked about this process of learning who we are from others and how others react to us, or how we think others see us, as the looking glass self. He argued that the self, who we think we are, comes about through three key elements: our imagination of our appearance to others, our imagination of that other person's judgment, and then a self-feeling such as pride or shame. This process helps us develop a mental image of our emotional structure as separate and distinct, a separate and distinct being from others. This is our sense of self. We come to know ourselves through the social reactions of others. These are called reflected appraisals, the process by which our self-views are influenced by our perceptions of how others view us. We form an opinion about ourselves based on what we perceive other people's opinion about us are. So let's turn to the process of the self-concept formation. This process of building our sense of self starts when we're very young. As children, we develop an initial idea of who we are through those negotiations with adults and with peers. We engage in a process of trial and error. We engage in trial behaviors that are consistent with the budding ideas of who we think we are. These trial behaviors can be thought of as claims about who we are. So after we've made a claim that we're the kind of person that is implied by the behavior that we're performing, we then wait for a social response to either confirm or deny the claims that we're making. So if others affirm what that behavior implies, then a tiny part of ourself is formed. If the response of the social audience says that we are not or cannot be what we're claiming to be, then this disconfirming evidence undermines the portion of the self that is implied by the behavior that evoked that response. So over time, through this trial and error, by emitting behaviors that reflect a tentative self and observing the responses to the behaviors, we form a concept of ourself that is personally reassuring. And although this process starts when we're young, we should remember that self-concepts are always somewhat tentative. Who we think we are does change and shift over time, even though we seem like, or we think that who we are is more or less stable. And because the sense of self actually is flexible and dynamic, this creates potential anxiety about ourself, about who we are. So we must constantly get confirmation of the self we have at any given time. When our sense of self is well developed and we get disconfirming evidence of who we are, we manage it in several ways. We might cognitively deny the response, discount the source of the reaction. We could ignore the reaction as a fluke. But if our sense of self is not fully developed, or if the disconfirming responsive are massive and continuous, then we rework our self-image. We engage in the process again. We try out new behaviors in line with our new idea of self and then wait to see if others accept those new claims. So the search for a stable, satisfying, and socially acceptable self motivates all kinds of behaviors, either to form a self-concept through trial and error or to confirm a self-concept that is already formed. So Edwin Lemert helps us understand the process of developing a sense of self and of getting a deviant label, in addition to how we sometimes then embrace and act through a deviant label. He talked about this process in terms of the ways others react to primary and secondary deviance. So we all engage in a variety of behaviors every day. We all engage in even deviant behavior every day. We don't always know before we engage in the behavior that it's actually deviant. So think about a time you accidentally or unintentionally did something that you learned after the fact was wrong or bad or deviant. We'll call that primary deviance. Primary deviance is the initial act of deviance, whether it's intentionally deviant or not. So thinking about that time you did something deviant for the first time, particularly if you didn't know it was deviant, how did others react to it? Lemert argued that the act of engaging in deviant behavior doesn't mean we will think of ourselves as deviant, particularly if the reactions from others are mild. If we and others can rationalize or excuse our deviant behavior as situational or as somehow context-driven, we won't label ourselves as deviant for engaging in that behavior. So an example for me was when I was a kid and I was caught shoplifting. The store security pulled me into their office and gave me the 3rd degree, which I tried to play off as accidental, like, oh, there's something in my bag. I didn't realize that. They weren't buying it. So they called my mom, who came down to pick me up. And the story she told the security guard about my shoplifting made sure that the deviant label didn't stick to me. Basically, she explained away my deviance as being the result of a situational factor, the fact that my grandmother had just died. Because she had a plausible story to explain why I did what I did, and that it wasn't a reflection of some deviant trait that lived inside of me, the label of deviant didn't stick. However, if my mother thought of me as like a bad seed, that might have been a different story. Lemert argued that a label can be more lasting if the deviance is highly visible, if the deviant behavior is repeated often, or if the deviant behavior has a really severe social reaction. So if my shoplifting had been really high profile and not something my mother could explain away with a story, or if the security guard had pressed charges and I was arrested, or if I had been caught shoplifting many times before, then the deviant label would have been more likely to stick. So Lemert talked about this sort of process about when a deviant label is applied, and then we adopt the deviant label, and that becomes what he calls secondary deviance. So let's talk about this. This process of secondary deviance starts with some primary initial act of deviance. We can be intentionally breaking a norm, or we can accidentally break a norm, but whatever it is, we have to do something that is seen as deviant by others. The example I'll use to illustrate this sort of sequence of deviance is the label my sister got as a wild child. It started young. When my sister and I were kids, my sister was always lagging behind, exploring some interesting thing on the ground, and just generally not getting in line with whatever our family wanted to do in the moment. Not a big deal, right? So this is primary deviance. This primary deviance has some social penalties for breaking that norm. That's the reaction that we get from others, and it tells us that what we did is deviant. When the penalties are mild, when they don't reach the level of what we'll talk about next as a degradation ceremony, they probably won't contribute to developing a deviant identity. So for example, the dirty looks and heavy sighs we get when we violate a folkway. And remember, a folkway is mild. Folkways are the rules for everyday behavior, like how you're supposed to greet someone, or how you act in an elevator. The sanctions we get when we violate a folkway are usually mild, like the side eye or the raised eyebrows, those heavy sighs, that kind of thing. But when we continue to engage in primary deviant behavior, which now has a label, we have a negative label that's been attached to that primary deviant behavior, but we still aren't necessarily internalizing or embracing the label of deviant yet. We're engaging in deviant behavior, but the label hasn't stuck. So, for example, my sister continued to be curious about the world and to go off on adventures. Our mom didn't know where she was half the time. She became known as the wild child, but it wasn't quite internalized yet. For it to become internalized, often the social response has to be really severe. This is what we'll call degradation ceremonies. So once we continue our deviant behavior and the penalties get stronger and stronger. So for us to adopt a deviant identity, those social penalties and social sanctions usually need to be really obvious and really severe. When they're obvious and really severe, they reach the level of what sociologists call degradation ceremonies. A degradation ceremony is a ceremony or activity that transforms or is intended to transform the identity or status of an individual into an identity or status that is lower down in the hierarchy of a group or an institution. So, for example, courts of law regularly enact degradation ceremonies, particularly when an individual is tried and convicted of a crime, and the judge publicly admonishes the individual while reading out the verdict, and that changes the individual's marked status to the status of a criminal. Other public forms of punishment can include things like, locking an individual in the stocks or something like that. So when deviance is illegal, we could get arrested and go through a degradation ceremony where the judge berates us. When the deviance is not illegal but taps into standards of moral and ethical behavior, those are known as mores, you'll probably recall, we could get sanctions like, other people physically restraining us, or we could be publicly shamed in the media or by our friends and families. These kinds of actions are degradation ceremonies. The public humiliation is designed to get us to rethink our bad behavior and often contributes to others treating us differently, whether we rethink our bad behavior or not. We and others can start thinking that we are deviant, not that we've done something deviant. So in the case of my sister, this labeling came to a head. I don't know if I would classify it so much as a degradation ceremony. I'll leave this up to you. So when my sister was a teenager, and for example, if she wasn't home by curfew, our mom would wait up for her and give her a big lecture about why she should keep her curfew. And then she'd get grounded. She'd have to do more chores. She just would have higher penalties for her deviance. And at the same time, just so you know, I wouldn't get in trouble for my behaviors. I did stay out after my curfew, but my mom very rarely knew that because I'd always get in before she woke up. And if I did get caught, I'd come up with a good reason and my mom would accept it. So my sister kept getting harsher and harsher penalties, and I kept getting away with it. This loop of primary deviance and social reaction continues. That can go on for a while. At this point, when we are reacting, our deviance might be even a hostile reaction to the punishers in this loop of primary deviance and social reaction. So for example, my sister got to the point where she knew she was going to get in trouble for whatever minor thing she did wrong. So she started doing things wrong on purpose, and she'd engage in bigger deviance along the way, all in reaction to knowing that she was going to get in trouble. She figured if you're going to do the time, you might as well get the crime. So at some point, that cycle of primary deviance and social reaction, especially when there's a degradation ceremony involved, gets big enough that we enter into self-labeling. So according to Lemert, at some point we reach this stage where we identify with and embrace the label of whatever deviant category we've been labeled with. In the mild case of my sister, she did embrace the label of wild child or black sheep. But she never really engaged in deviance that brings about the very severe social sanctions, such as, getting kicked out of the house or getting sent to jail. But say she had gone to jail or gotten kicked out of the house or some other severe sanction. The next step would be to, once she accepted that deviant identity, to begin associating with other people with a similar identity. So this is once we have accepted the deviant label, we start interacting with deviant subcultures, other people who have that same kind of deviant label. As this part of this process, when we're interacting with people in this deviant subculture, we start to amplify our deviance. We start to engage in more of the kind of deviance that we've been labeled for. We start to intensify the amount or type of deviance we engage in. So at that point, this has now become secondary deviance. So secondary deviance is deviant behavior that results from being publicly labeled as deviant, internalizing that deviant label, and being treated differently, being treated as an outsider, being treated as a deviant person. So, for example, if my sister had been, kicked out of the house for being a deviant, she would have been homeless or couch surfing. She would have had little supervision and lots of opportunities to engage in rule breaking. And that's to say, once we've gone through this long process of engaging in deviance and receiving social sanctions, increasingly harsher social sanctions, we come to the point where we agree with our punishers. We agree that we are what they say we are, and we act in line with this new identity. In fact, often when people have accepted their deviant label, they'll create retrospective accounts that confirm the label. Retrospective accounts are when we look back at our past actions and we see them through the lens of our new identity. So we'll look back on our deviance and say, oh yes, I was always like that. We'll start remembering incidents that prove that we are as deviant as they say we are. And other people engage in these retrospective accounts too. They'll look back at our behaviors or their interactions with us and say, oh yes, they were always a bad seed. And they'll come up with stories that provide more evidence that we are a deviant person, not someone engaging in a deviant behavior, but a deviant person. So overall, this process of how we become deviant and we start to intensify our deviant behavior starts with engaging in some deviant behavior. Then there is a social reaction to that behavior. And then we go through what's called role engulfment, that we embrace the identity, and that deviant identity supersedes all other roles. So even if we have the role of, daughter or mother or student or employee, all of those roles take a back seat to the deviant role. We engage in more behaviors then because we've adopted that deviant identity. So that's the explanation of the cycle of how labeling someone as deviant and then treating them differently, the social response to their deviant behavior, can become internalized and then intensified. In this way, this creates that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. We treat someone as if they are deviant, then they understand themselves to be deviant because of the way we've treated them, and then they engage in further deviant behavior. John Braithwaite proposed reintegrative shaming to avoid the long-term negative consequences of labeling. Braithwaite discussed the kind of negative labeling we've been talking about as disintegrative shaming or stigmatization. Disintegrative shaming is a punitive approach to deviant behavior where the focus is on punishing the offender. Punishment and negative labels often lead to stigmatization and social exclusion. So let's take the case of a university student that was caught cheating. If the university's response is solely punitive without any supportive measures, it's an example of disintegrative shaming. Negative labels and disintegrative shaming not only labels, but also isolate the individual from the community, potentially exacerbating feelings of alienation. In contrast, Braithwaite's reintegrative shaming balances the need to disapprove of and correct wrongdoing with the need to reintegrate the offender back into the community. It's not just about pointing out what was wrong. It's about doing so in a way that doesn't irreparably harm the individual's relationship with their community or their sense of self-worth. This approach involves a critical element of respect and acceptance for the individual despite the wrongdoing. It's based on the understanding that everyone makes mistakes, and these mistakes shouldn't define a person's entire identity or future. So in the context of the student caught cheating, a reintegrative shaming approach would mean that the university authorities, instead of solely imposing a punitive measure, would engage in a meaningful dialogue with the student. The dialogue would address the cheating incident, acknowledging its seriousness and the breach of trust it represents. The conversation would clearly express disapproval of the student's action, emphasizing why cheating is detrimental to both the individual and the academic community. However, crucially, this disapproval would be directed at the act of cheating itself, not at the student as a person. The university could then offer support to help the student understand the ethical implications of their actions and to develop better coping strategies for academic pressure or whatever the motivation was to engage in cheating. So this might include counseling, mentorship, or opportunities to participate in ethics workshops. The aim is to restore trust and guide the student toward making better choices in the future. And throughout this process, it's important that the student doesn't feel ostracized from the academic community. Keeping communication channels open, allowing the student to continue their studies, and encouraging positive interactions with peers and faculty members are all part of reintegrating the student back into the university community. By using this approach, the likelihood of the student repeating the behavior may decrease as they understand the implications of their actions and feel supported in making positive changes. And importantly, especially for labeling theory, the student's identity as a student and a valued member of the community is preserved, which is crucial for their self-esteem and for their future development. So, the goal of reintegrative shaming is to make the individual understand the impact of their actions, but to do so in a way that maintains their connection to the community. Okay, let's talk about the strengths and limitations of labeling theories to understand criminal behavior. One criticism of labeling theory is that it may overemphasize the role of social reaction and underplay the individual's agency and the initial reasons for deviant behavior. Second, the impact of labels on individual behavior is complex and can be difficult to measure and quantify, which poses challenges for empirical validation of the theory. Third, in focusing primarily on the offender and societal reactions, labeling theory can sometimes neglect the experiences and perspectives of victims of crime. Fourth, the theory is more applicable to certain types of crime and deviance, such as juvenile delinquency and petty crime, and less so for serious or violent crimes, which may have different dynamics. Fifth, there's a risk that labeling theory can oversimplify the complex interplay of factors that contribute to criminal behavior, such as socioeconomic conditions, family background, and individual psychology. And sixth, some critics argue that the theory could encourage a laissez-faire attitude toward minor crimes, under the assumption that intervention or punishment might lead to further deviance. But there are many strengths of labeling theory. One major strength of labeling theory is its emphasis on the social processes that contribute to criminal behavior. Labeling theories shift the focus from individual pathology to the role of social reactions and interactions in the development of criminal identity. Also, labeling theories provide a framework for understanding why some individuals continue to commit crimes. It suggests that the stigma attached to being labeled a criminal can hinder reintegration into society and can perpetuate a cycle of crime. Labeling theory helps us consider the impact of the criminal justice system in creating and reinforcing criminal identities, which can inform policies and practices aimed at reducing recidivism through more rehabilitative and less stigmatizing approaches. And by focusing on how labels impact individuals, labeling theory promotes a more empathetic understanding of offenders. It humanizes offenders and challenges the traditional us versus them mentality in criminal justice. Finally, the theory has influenced various policy reforms, including the development of diversion programs, juvenile justice reforms, and restorative justice initiatives aimed at reducing the stigmatization of offenders. So let's talk about some of those policy implications. Criminal justice policies inspired by labeling theories focus on reducing stigma and promoting rehabilitation. They advocate for more empathetic approaches in the justice system, emphasizing rehabilitation over punishment. So what if we don't label people who've engaged in minor deviance as criminals, deviants, or delinquents? Radical non-intervention suggests it's often better not to intervene in minor delinquent behavior, especially among juveniles or for less serious offenses like drug possession for personal use, public intoxication, and sometimes sex work. Now remember, labeling theory argues that intervention by the criminal justice system, even with the best of intentions, can sometimes do more harm than good, leading to labeling and sometimes even the subsequent escalation of deviant behavior. So if the act of labeling an individual as a delinquent or criminal can have long-lasting negative effects, then formal intervention like arrest and prosecution can set a young person on a path of continued deviance, partly due to the social stigma and altered self-perception resulting from the criminal label. Similarly, pre-trial intervention programs are alternatives to the traditional criminal justice process, typically available to first-time nonviolent offenders. These pretrial intervention programs allow eligible individuals to avoid formal prosecution by meeting specific conditions, such as undergoing counseling, participating in community service, or completing educational programs. These interventions reflect labeling theory in the sense that they aim to prevent the initial assignment of a criminal label to an individual. By avoiding formal charges and convictions, individuals are less likely to be stigmatized and labeled as criminals. And this minimizes the risk of that self-fulfilling prophecy where individuals internalize and then live up to these negative labels. Labeling theory also argues that we should decriminalize many less serious offenses and move away from incarceration as a primary response to crime. Decriminalizing less serious offenses can reduce the burden on the criminal justice system and may mitigate the long-term consequences of having a criminal record for minor offenses. Decriminalization aims to prevent the stigmatization of individuals for behaviors that are often nonviolent and which may be linked to personal circumstances or health issues, such as addiction. By removing the criminal label from these activities, labeling theory suggests that individuals will be less likely to get entrenched in the criminal justice system, will be less likely to adopt and internalize a criminal label, and will be more likely to seek help or rehabilitation services. Labeling theories would also advocate for deinstitutionalization. This means moving away from the use of jails and prisons for certain offenders, particularly those with nonviolent crimes or mental health issues or substance abuse problems. The focus of deinstitutionalization is on rehabilitation through community-based programs, mental health treatment, and support services instead of incarceration. The goal of deinstitutionalization in this context is to provide more humane and effective treatment, to reduce the high costs associated with incarceration, and to avoid the process of creating and internalizing a criminal identity. When such an identity is developed, incarceration, especially for nonviolent and minor offenses, can lead to increased recidivism because of that criminal identity. By providing alternatives to incarceration such as therapy, vocational training, and drug rehabilitation, deinstitutionalization seeks to address the root causes of criminal behavior and reduce the likelihood of reoffense, because these alternatives give offenders an opportunity to develop a non-criminal identity. Well, that's it. That's it for labeling theory. I hope you learned a lot, and I'll see you next time.